At last, the first day of my long-awaited vacation arrived. I stayed up later than usual, savoring the rare silence that filled the apartment. By then, my wife Helen had already left for work. My son Alex was off at school, and my mother-in-law had headed to her dacha. It had been years, yes, years, since I last managed to carve out time for a proper vacation, and I dreamed of spending it with my family. Sadly, work obligations had pushed my time off to the fall, leaving me to face these quiet days on my own. As I fixed myself some breakfast, a wave of disappointment crept in. Spending this break alone wasn't quite how I'd pictured it. But determined not to let the blues win, I shook off the gloom and sketched out plans for a slow, unhurried day. There was no rush, no pressure, just the kind of peace I'd been craving. Helen was due home by 6:30, her job wrapping up at 5 o'clock, and I decided to surprise everyone by preparing dinner. I pictured the whole family gathered around the table, laughing and chatting like we hadn't done in what felt like forever. Evening rolled around, and dinner was ready. My son and mother-in-law returned home as expected, but my wife was nowhere to be seen. I asked Alex if he had any idea when his mom would be back, but he shrugged, suggesting I either ask his grandmother or call her directly. Neither option yielded any answers. Growing restless, I eventually served dinner to everyone, including the cat, and waited for Helen to walk through the door. Finally, at 11 p.m., the front door clicked open. She tiptoed into the bedroom, visibly surprised to find me wide awake. Ignoring her question about why I wasn't asleep, I flicked on the light. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" She froze, caught off guard by my sudden directness, before stammering out an explanation. Apparently, she'd been stuck in a meeting at work that dragged on forever, and her phone had been set to silent mode. She apologized, admitting she'd completely forgotten about my vacation and the calls she'd missed. Sitting beside her, I laid out my plans for the rest of the week, and she listened, genuinely engaged. After finishing her tea, she leaned in, wrapping me in a tight hug. The tension I'd been carrying all evening melted away. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. In that moment, I knew everything would be all right. Earlier in the week, I decided to visit my hometown, a trip I hadn't made in years. I was eager to spend time with my parents, catch up with old friends, and enjoy a fishing trip with my dad. I'd planned to take Alex along, but he flat out refused, claiming he was too busy. Ah, the joys of raising a teenager. Undeterred, I started getting ready for the trip, and my first task was to locate my trusty hiking backpack. To my dismay, it was nowhere to be found. Had it been tossed out, or just misplaced? Hoping for the latter, I rummaged through closets, cabinets, and drawers until I finally spotted it tucked away on the bottom shelf of a dresser. As I pulled it out, a small lilac box caught my eye. Intrigued, I fished it out and immediately recognized the brand logo. Inside was a pair of bright red stiletto heels, elegant, expensive, and made from the softest leather. Confused, I couldn't help but wonder, whose shoes were these? Helen wasn't one for flashy heels, and certainly wouldn't splurge on something like this without mentioning it. Had she been hiding them? But why? After a few minutes of overthinking, I landed on the idea that they might have been a gift. But from who? A friend? A coworker? Or, heaven forbid, a man? Shaking off the thought, I decided to ask her later and went back to packing. As I gathered my fishing gear and other essentials, another memory surfaced. The set of old keys I always brought with me on trips to my parents' house. I hadn't seen them in ages, not since my last visit years ago. They weren't particularly useful anymore, but something about having them in my pocket always felt comforting, like carrying a piece of the past. I searched high and low, retracing steps in my mind, until I checked the storage locker where Helen kept all kinds of odds and ends. Sure enough, there they were. Smiling at the nostalgia, I tucked them safely into my bag and continued getting ready. Amidst the jumble of items in the locker, I finally found my keys, As I pulled them out, a few scraps of paper fell loose, scattering across the floor. One, in particular, caught my attention, a small piece of purple paper, torn from a notebook. Without much thought, I picked it up and read the hastily scrawled words. "This is my number. Be sure to call me. I'll be waiting. Arthur." The note left me puzzled. Who was this Arthur? Who was the message meant for? And more importantly, how had it ended up among my belongings? I read it again and again, but no memory surfaced, no connection to anyone by that name. Even Helen had never mentioned an Arthur in her stories or conversations. My thoughts began to spiral, but before I could make sense of anything, the sharp ring of the phone pulled me back to the present. Setting the paper aside, I answered the call, and soon enough, the note drifted to the back of my mind. Later that day, I headed to the local supermarket to pick up groceries and some last-minute fishing supplies. Just as I walked through the entrance, I felt a light tug on my sleeve. Turning, I found myself face to face with Susan, one of Helen's friends. I'd seen her before in passing, but had never actually spoken to her. She was striking, long blonde hair, a radiant smile, but there was something about her presence that unsettled me, a gut feeling I couldn't shake. "Douglas," she exclaimed brightly. "Fancy seeing you here. Why the long face? You look so glum." "Hello, Susan," I replied, glancing at my watch to emphasize my haste. "Sorry, I'm a bit pressed for time." But Susan ignored my attempt to brush her off. "Oh, come on. What's the rush? Tell me, how are you? What's new?" She smiled warmly, stepping closer. "Why don't we sit down and have a quick chat? It's been ages since I've talked to someone like you." I shook my head, trying to remain polite. "That's kind of you, but I really need to get going," I said firmly. "Maybe another time." Her persistence, however, knew no bounds. Before I could react, she took my hand, intertwining her fingers with mine, and moved uncomfortably close. I exhaled, the frustration mounting. Something about her demeanor felt too invasive, too calculated. With a calm but firm gesture, I freed my hand, taking the step back. "Susan, I'm sorry if I seem abrupt, but I really can't stay. Helen will be home soon, and I have a lot to prepare." My tone was measured, though the situation was growing increasingly awkward. But Susan wasn't done. Blocking my path, she tilted her head and gave me a piercing look. "What's wrong? Don't you like me?" she asked, her voice dropping into a curious, almost teasing tone. I hesitated, caught off guard by her sudden shift in attitude. "Susan," I began carefully, trying to steady my voice. "This isn't about liking or not liking you. I just don't understand what you're trying to do here, but I'm not interested. I love Helen, and I'd appreciate it if you respected that." "Oh, how sweet," she said, a hint of sarcasm lacing her words. "Rushing off to your dear Helen, are we? But let me ask you something, Douglas. Are you sure she's worthy of all that devotion?" Her words hit me like a slap. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Susan held my gaze, a sly glint flickering in her eyes, but said nothing. The silence between us stretched on, growing heavier with every passing second. Finally, she broke eye contact and muttered, "Forget it. I shouldn't have said anything." Relieved yet rattled, I turned and made my way into the supermarket, leaving her behind. The encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Something about her words, her tone, lingered long after I'd walked away. That evening, Helen stayed late at work again. I fell asleep before she returned, and when I woke the next morning, she was already gone. On the kitchen table, I found a note wishing me a safe trip and a happy journey. It was a kind gesture, but it didn't ease the nagging sense of discomfort that had been building inside me. After saying goodbye to Alex and my mother-in-law, I set off for my hometown. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. By evening, I texted Helen to let her know I'd arrived safely, but hours passed without a reply. Feeling restless, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed to the water, hoping the quiet rhythm of casting a line would distract me. But even as the calm waves lapped against the shore, I couldn't shake the heaviness that weighed on my mind. The next morning, I decided to call my son. "Hi, how are you?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Oh, hi, Dad," came his flat, disinterested response. "Everything all right?" I pressed, hoping for more than a one-word answer. What could possibly happen in just one day? He shot back, his tone slightly defensive. I let out a sigh. "Never mind that. Just tell me, how's your mom doing?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that told me my son was trying to figure out what to say. I gripped the phone tighter. "Well," I prompted, my voice firmer now. "Is something wrong?" "No," he finally replied, though his hesitation was unsettling. "She's fine. She's just out of town for a few days, on a work trip to New York." "What?" I blurted out, my stomach tightening. She never mentioned any business trip. The son sighed heavily, clearly not in the mood to ask questions. "Don't take it out on me, Dad. Ask her yourself. Listen, I have a workout right now, so I have to go. We'll talk later." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Helen never mentioned a trip. Why wouldn't she tell me? My head started pounding, and the room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. I needed air. Grabbing my jacket, I headed to the nearby forest. The crisp autumn air greeted me, and the crunch of leaves underfoot was oddly comforting. The earthy scent of damp soil and the peaceful rustling of the trees began to clear my head, but the unease lingered, shadowing my every thought. I couldn't stop thinking about the red stilettos I'd found in our closet 6 days ago, hidden in a lilac box, or the strange note I'd stumbled upon. "This is my number. Be sure to call me. I'll be waiting. Arthur." And then there was Susan, with her unsettling comments and cryptic hints. Why hadn't I confronted Helen about any of it? What was happening in her life that I was completely in the dark about? The questions buzzed relentlessly in my mind. How long had this been going on? And what exactly was this? I didn't want to face the possibility that Helen, the woman I'd shared my life with, might be slipping away from me, turning into someone I no longer recognized. The idea made my chest ache. I walked aimlessly through the forest, lost in thought, until the sky began to darken. The shadows stretched long across the ground, and the cold began to seep in, nudging me to head back. By the time I returned to my parents' house, the unease still clung to me like a second skin. In a couple of days, I'd be back in the city, back to our apartment. Helen would be there, and life would pick up where it left off, or at least it would appear that way. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I could feel it, a quiet crack beneath the surface. I told myself I was content to keep my eyes closed, to pretend everything was fine. But the truth was, nothing felt fine anymore.